Everyone, and welcome to the forum for the talk today titled Arabic in Israel, the consequences of harnessing language for security, presented by Dr. Mendel. Yonatan Mendel is a senior lecturer in the Department of Middle East Studies at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev and head of the Arabic Language and Culture Division. His main interests are the position, status, and teaching of Arabic in Israel, Jewish-Arab relations as reflected in language and culture, and the sociology, politics, and practice of translating from Arabic into Hebrew. At the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, he has initiated and advanced many projects, the most important of which is Manarat, the Van Leer Center for Jewish-Arab Relations, which he has also headed for several years. Today, he's director of the Translators Forum at the Institute and the associate editor of the Maktub series, which is devoted to the translation of Arabic literature into Hebrew. Among his translations is Walking on Winds by late Palestinian writer Salman Natur and Goodbye Acre by Allah Lechel. The floor is yours, Dr. Mendel.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here with you. I wasn't sure exactly if the talk should be, I don't know, more of a lecture or more of a discussion. And my feeling is that it should be more of a discussion. Like I know many of you, I know some of your work, and I think that it will be good for me maybe to start and kick off by giving a few general ideas about my research and about things that I've done and about projects that I'm currently involved in. And maybe also I will not run away of saying something about the topic of today's discussion. What are the consequences of harnessing Arabic for security as I see it? But I'll be very happy indeed to hear your views and insights and to hear your insights and so on and so forth. As Chanel kindly said, also I'm grateful to the people who invited me, to the scholars who thought that I'm entitled to be invited to this forum. Professor Makoni, it's a great honor to see you here. Dr. Ashraf Abdel Hay and other friends as well. As Chanel said, my work focuses on the place of Arabic. And I look at the place of Arabic from a few different perspectives. One will be the legal one. Is Arabic official? When was it official? When wasn't it official? What is its current status? And obviously questions that are related to what does it all say? If Arabic used to be an official language and now it is no longer an official language, how does it inflict on the people who speak Arabic as a first language? Obviously the Palestinian citizens of Israel. I also look at teaching of language. Arabic is taught mandatorily in Jewish schools, but the question is who teach Arabic and why Arabic is being taught and what are the outcomes or what are the, on the one hand, what are the aims of the study and on the other hand, what are the actual achievements of the student in Arabic, by saying, just as I said before about the status, that it's actually, I'm asking, what does it all say? If Arabic is being taught according to a specific method, if the achievements are one, if the aims are why, and so on and so forth, what does it all say? What can we learn from this about Israel, about the nature of Israel, about the way that Israel looks at the Middle East, about the way Israel looks at Arabic speakers as a mother tongue, both the Palestinian, but also, for example, Arab Jews whose first language is Arabic. And I'm trying to understand, so you already, I kind of mentioned it very briefly, to understand relations between Jews and Arabic through the prism of Arabic. So there are a lot of solid and important and insightful research about the relations between Jews and Arabs. One will look, I don't know, from the diplomatic point of view, another through hardcore politics, another through sociological analysis. And I believe that language, also because I am a student of Professor Yasser Suleiman, but also a few of the things that I've learned in life, language in a way captures a lot of the things that we do not want to speak about. In other words, by understanding more about the way Israel treats Arabic, about the status of Arabic, the teaching of Arabic, the place of Arabic, I will be able to learn many things that official Israel, but also generally the people who will be interviewed are willing to say about Arabs. So in a way, I take Arabic as a soft, so to speak, component that helps me to understand, or I'm trying to understand, both these facts or this the worldview that I'm studying, but also things that will be more general. My PhD was turned into a book, and it is called The Creation of Israeli Arabic. It was also translated to Arabic, and it was called تكون اللغة العربية الإسرائيلية, published by مركز الأبحاث في الدوحة في قطر. And the Hebrew version was published 2 years ago. It was an updated new version that I called it in Hebrew, שפה מחוץ למקומה, or in English, language out of place. Speaking about a few processes that have made Arabic to be studied and taught and perceived as a language that is not in its place. What do I do today? So I follow up on the things that I've just said, and I do further research about Arabic. So for example, one of my studies is about Palestinian Yiddish, which is a German Jewish language taught, spoken at the 19th century. Well, obviously it is also spoken today, but this Palestinian variant or the Palestinian dialect was spoken here in Palestine, Israel at the 19th century. So I'm trying to understand what can we learn about the relations between Jews and Arabs through the focus on this specific dialect of Palestinian Yiddish. Yiddish that is enriched or influenced by Arabic elements. And also I work on another book that will be first published this time in Hebrew and then in English. And it's about Arabic and debates about Arabic in the Jewish community at the end of the empire, Ottoman Empire, and throughout the British Mandate, 1908 to 1948. But I also try to be a researcher that does not only write research. Not that I don't think that it is important, and obviously many of my dearest friends and colleagues around the world are doing it. I just feel that it will be too little to do in a place that experiences ongoing conflict, an ongoing battle, ongoing occupation, ongoing siege, ongoing injustice, as I see it. So with the modest power that I have as a scholar who is doing research about Arabic, I try also to do things in the real world. So there were a few petitions that were made to the Supreme Court about the status of Arabic in Israel. And I was among those who supported the continuation of the Arabic status to remain official. This was a status, I will mention it later, but this was a status from 1922 up until 2018. In 2018, once the nationality bill, the Jewish nationality bill was legislated, so Arabic lost its official status. So I'm trying with obviously a group of other friends and colleagues and scholars to try and work against this decision, for example, through petitions to the Supreme Court, but also through act in the Knesset. There is a group of members of the Knesset that are trying to put a new bill to bring Arabic its official status back. Is it really important that Arabic would be an official language? Okay, it's a fair question, because we know that there is a huge difference between official status and everyday practice of a language. But I believe, and I will try to defend it later on, that the symbolic representation of Arabic is also very much important to our discussion. Another topic from the real world is the signage. Israeli linguistic landscape is filled with Hebrew and Zionist and Israeli-oriented signs. Arabic usually only translates the Hebrew, but it first translates it very wrongly. So using even letters that are not in Arabic, but in Persian, and writing signs with many, many mistakes, but also with the load of the content. So like a change is needed there on both ways. And I'm trying again to be active on this. There is another committee that is dedicated to the change of signage in Israel, the place of Arabic on signs, and I'm doing things in that direction as well. Also a new program to teach Arabic in schools. As I will mention today very briefly, Arabic in Israel is based on two pillars. One is very much Latinized. We teach Arabic in a similar way to the way Arabic was taught in German universities at the end of 19th century. So on the one problem will be Latinization, and another problem will be securitization, which means that the language is being securitized. And the new program that, again, with other organizations in Israel, some of which are Palestinian joint Jewish-Palestinian organization, we're trying to push forward a new program to the teaching of Arabic because, and again, this is my belief, I believe that if we change the way Arabic is being taught, and if we change the achievements of students and the associations of the students with Arabic, we will be able to change many other things that currently are left unspoken. Last but not least, it sounds like an advertisement, but I promise you it's important project. It's a project called Maktub. Maktub is the only actual series of books in the world that is dedicated to the translation of Arabic literature from Arabic to Hebrew. And we are a binational, bilingual project. So we have one associate editor that will be Jewish, the other will be Palestinian, one, and so on and so forth. And we are trying also to push forward a new model for translation, which all comes to the fact that the knowledge of Jewish Israelis about Arabic culture, Arabic language, Arabic people, Arab people is very, very low. And if it exists, it is many times the outcome of security-oriented filters. And by changing the world or the field of translation, we hope to be able to change other things as well. So this is me and Arabic, and why I think that it is important to focus on Arabic from this academic point of view or through academic research, but also why I believe that it is important, especially in Israel in 2022, to try and use this knowledge and these activities also for other causes. In order to speak more directly about the question that I started with, which is what are the consequences of harnessing Arabic for security in Israel, I will mention a few very quick facts. So forgive me if many of you, it will be common knowledge for you, but I think that it is important for the sake of the things that I will say later, or why securitizing Arabic is so different to the roots or to the nature or to the history of the two languages, Hebrew and Arabic, and of the relations between the Jewish people and the Arabic language. So to begin with, Arabic, as we all know, is a Semitic language, and the other Semitic language that is very popular here in Israel is Hebrew. So we are speaking about the language that is what we can call in literature a sister language. Both are sisters to the Semitic family of languages. There are maybe out there in the world languages that are more similar to Hebrew than Arabic, for example, Aramaic, but on a world level, meaning languages that are being spoken as a first language on an international and on a huge level, Arabic is definitely the closest language to Hebrew in the world. Second, Arabic was always in the place that is today called Israel and Palestine, was always the language of majority. I say always, I speak about the last 1,000 years, in the sense of that the change that was created or that happened in 1948 was a very dramatic change. Not only the creation of the state of Israel, and the first time in modern history that Jewish people make a majority within a country in Israel, Palestine, but also vis-a-vis the status of Arabic. It was the first time that Arabic changed its status from the language of majority to the language of minority. And as a language of majority, throughout the centuries, 15th century, 16th century, 17th century, 18th century, 19th century, Jews who lived in the country had to have a basic knowledge of Arabic. It was very clear at the 18th century and at the end of the 19th century periods that we also have quite a lot of evidence from this period, meaning the Jews who were born in Safed, Hebron, Tiberia, Jerusalem, the four cities that are called the four sacred cities, always needed or had to have also basic knowledge on Arabic because they lived in a country that was populated by and large by people who that Arabic was the first language, including Jews. The connection between Jews and Arabic obviously is not only related to Israel and Palestine, but is a general connection. Arabic was a language of creation and a language of Jewish philosophy and Jewish writing and Jewish liturgy. Up until the 12th century, it is said that 90% of Jewish texts were written either in Arabic or in Judeo-Arabic, meaning Arabic written in Hebrew letters. So important people, great philosophers, great scholars, great writers that everybody in Israel known, from Yehuda Levi to Harambam, Musa ibn Maimon, to Shmuel HaNagid, Samuel ibn Nagrila, to Abu al-Hassan Yahud al-Lawi, and so on and so forth, were all people whose first language was Arabic, or the language of creation was Arabic. So we speak about a language that is very much connected and related to the Jewish people before the rise of Zionism, before the national conflict in Palestine. And I think it is important to mention because it helps us understand the gap or the abyss that has opened with the conflict vis-a-vis the relations of Jews and Arabic language. Last thing to say about Arabic, Arabic was an official language of the state. It began during the Ottoman period. Arabic was not an official language. Also, the concept of official language was not was different to the ones that we know today. The country that is today Palestine, Eretz Israel, was part of the Ottoman Empire, which means that official correspondence with the empire had to be done in Ottoman Turkish, meaning Ottoman written in Turkish written in Arabic letters. But having said that, the lingua franca of the place was Arabic also throughout the Ottoman Empire. In 1922, due to a decision of King George V, it was decided that the language of the British Mandate, that the British Mandate will use 3 official languages. First is English, second is Arabic, third is Hebrew. A decision that was rather controversial in Palestinian eyes, because the status of the language of the Jewish people, who at the time made maybe 10% of the people living in the country, received the same status as the majority of the people who lived in the country, more than 90% who spoke Arabic. This way or another, Arabic was an official language in 1922, all the way up to 1948. In 1948, following the Palestinian Nakba and the creation of the State of Israel, Israel decides regarding official languages to do one thing, to keep all official languages as they used to be, and actually all legislation related to language, but to erase the status of English, which means that Arabic remained an official language after 1948 because it was not erased, because it was not deleted, and it remained official, at least on paper, up until 2018, and then in 2018, together with the legislation that it calls the Jewish Nationality Bill, it lost its official status, and it is now no longer an official language of the state. It is a language with special status, which content has yet to be decided. And now about the topic. I think you asked me kind of to speak about 20, 25 minutes, so we will have more of a discussion. So maybe I'll take, if it's all right, Chanel, like 5 or 10 more minutes, and I can speak briefly about the idea of securitization, and then to say why I think it is important to be discussed. When the idea of separation grew stronger, meaning that there is a desire to create a Jewish national home in Palestine that will have a Jewish majority, which means that there will be villages that will be established. Today, one can call them settlements, that will be established and will be for Jewish people only. Was an idea that was related to the Zionist ethos of coming back to the land of our forefathers, in inverted commas or in quote, and to be able to be free people like all other people, enjoying national rights and so on and so forth. But the idea of separation also meant that there will be a very acute rift or division between the people who live in the country. One will have one national movement that will lead it, also known as the Zionist National Movement, and the others, the Palestinians, crystallizes around the Arab National Movement. Also vis-a-vis languages. If up until then Hebrew was a language that was not nationally related, not nationally connected, Hebrew was a language that was connected to sacred texts. For 2,000 years, Hebrew was not a language that a mother would speak with her child, or that a father would speak with his daughter, and so on and so forth. But the decision of Zionism was to revive Hebrew, and again, one would say revive, others would say revitalize, others would say renew, but to do something with Hebrew, making it more widely used, because it needs to serve a national cause. And this national cause also brought more and more people not to see the connection between Hebrew and Arabic as two Semitic languages. Both are written from right to left, both are having the same root system with 3 letters, but to see it almost as two languages that are found on a zero-sum game. Meaning, instead of seeing Arabic and Hebrew as two languages that suck from the same origin, gradually the decision was, or the idea was, to look at Arabic as something that is different than Hebrew. Obviously, the same was also about the people who lived there. Relation between Jews and Muslim, relation between Jewish Zionists and Arab Palestinians. If before and in the 19th century, but also at the beginning of the period of the British Mandate, we could have thought of different coalitions in the country, which mean a coalition of a Jewish person who lived in Tiberia and spoke Arabic as a first language and is what we call today the old Yishuv, with his Muslim neighbor, and they will be on the same side criticizing, for example, new immigrants from Russia who came with the idea of separation and idea of national movement, so on and so forth. Gradually, and especially in the 1920s and more so in the 1930s, these coalitions hardly exist. And the idea is that the two people gathers around two national movements, two flags, two languages. As such, Arabic stopped being perceived as the language of the self and was more and more seen and perceived as the language of the other. One, it was conceived, or one, it was perceived as the language of the other, together with the heated conflict on the ground. And as I say, 1920, so we are aware of two major events, 1921 and 1929, later on in 1936, 1939. The idea of zero-sum game became stronger and stronger, and the Zionist movement makes a decision to use Arabic as one of the tools or one of the political tools of the movement. Meaning, after hundreds and thousands of years of creation, of Jewish creation in Arabic, a decision was made to use Arabic, for example, for psychological warfare, for example, for propaganda, for example, for security-oriented purposes, spying. Up until then, the idea was not existed, first because we did not have a national conflict between the sides, and secondly because the perception of Hebrew and Arabic was not a perception, or the perception of Arabic was not a perception of an enemy-oriented language, but very much of an area's language, a region's language, a neighbor's language, and also, as I said before, language of the self. And what has happened that more and more people, and obviously the decision was made from top to bottom, but also bottom up. More and more people who immigrated to the country, who were not part of that historical roots to Arabic and so on and so forth, were saying, why should we study Arabic to begin with? We need to be proud of our Hebrew language and we should not study Arabic. And then the only, so to speak, practical reason that the authorities could have come with, and we start with the Zionist movement 1930s, 1930s, but we continue after 1948 with the State of Israel, is if we study Arabic, we will be able to protect the national security of Israel. And this has become the number one factor of motivation for the students, and the number one networks of expertise, if we speak top to bottom. In other words, when I can give it as an example, in the 1950s, there is a huge, and then we're already in the State of Israel, there is a huge decline in the study of Arabic in schools. Students are saying, we don't want to study Arabic. Why should we study Arabic? First, Arabs are no longer the majority. Why should we, in our new state, freedom, and why should we learn the language of the minority? We should be proud of our majority language of Hebrew. This is a patriotic language. We should be patriotic people. We should be proud of our flag. If Arabs want to speak with us, they're welcome, but they need to study Hebrew. So we see how Arabic lost its practicality after 1948. But then there are two organizations in Israel that are saying, but wait, we actually need Israelis to study Arabic, Jewish Israelis to study Arabic. And these two organizations were the military regime, because in between 1948 to 1966, the Palestinian citizens of Israel were held under military regime, and the military intelligence, that was the branch in the IDF in charge of controlling, deceiving, translating, you name it, the Arab people who live outside Israel. In other words, the two factors of motivation, or the two most practical ideas vis-a-vis why Arabic is important, came from two very large institutions, both of them security and military oriented, both of them in charge of controlling and supervising the life of Palestinians, either inside Israel or outside Israel. This has led, and you know, sometimes it's important, I'm not sure if some of you think it, but if I give this talk in Israel in Hebrew, so many people are saying, but that I portray it like Arabic was totally securitized, that the only reason students study Arabic was for security-oriented reasons. that the Minister of Education said, I don't know, first importance is that we need to study Arabic for security-oriented purposes. It's not what I say. What I say is that the security apparatus and the security factors have become a natural, commonsensical member or component in the discussion of Arabic. And I believe that this is a very major event. It would have been too easy, I think, if it was written in the Ministry of Education, Arabic should be taught because it's the language of the enemy. Because these things usually hardly ever happen. So the Ministry of Education would say things like, it is important to study Arabic to maintain a dialogue between the Middle East and something that will be general and that will not say much. But when I look at the way that Arabic was taught in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 20s, and up until today, and I look at other factors, for example, how many supervisors on Arabic studies were Arabs? And I found out that there was none, never. Always the supervisor on Arabic studies are Jewish Israelis. If I look at why Jews study Arabic for final exams, and I find out that from 1948 up until today, number one reason is their desire to be recruited to the military intelligence. If I look at networks, what are the things that create or that bring motivation to the students to study Arabic? Is it a 1 week experience living with Palestinians in Sakhnin or Al-Fahim or I don't know, East Jerusalem? Or is it a 1 week pre-military course in which they study about the importance of Arabic? And I found out that this is the latter. So all in all, harnessing Arabic for security, harnessing security for the study of Arabic, and generally using the security card as one of the components is a major thing and a major shift in the relationship between Jews and Arabic. And I will now speak only about 5 factors and I will end with them. First of all, because it created a situation that the military is almost part of the circle of life of Arabic experts in Israel. It means that if one studied Arabic in school, and then instead of going to the military or joining military intelligence, he or she decided to refuse not to go to the IDF or not to serve in the IDF, it is very unlikely that they will continue with the study of Arabic later on and that they will be considered as relevant, solid, there is a good word in it for Hebrew, credible experts of Arabic. In other words, a Jewish Israeli who studied Arabic in school, went to military intelligence and continued to do a degree in Arabic in the university is the #1 combination of Arabic experts in Israel. So it means that instead of looking at the military experience as something that is foreign, something that is strange, something that is not connected to the circle of life of Arabic experts, it is exactly the opposite. And networks of, sometimes in English it is called old boys club. People know each other because they know, oh, he served there, she served there, oh, we met there. It's like a golf club. And I think that this is an important thing, the naturalization, the fact that serving in the security, in the military intelligence, in military-oriented position, in Arabic-oriented positions in the military, has become almost a natural part in the debate about Arabic in Israel, is, I think, a major shift and also a very dangerous one. Secondly, imagine that this is the situation, and that many of the experts who are in Israel and are experts of Arabic and are taking part of Arabic studies and Arabic explanations and Arabic and so on and so forth, Would a Palestinian citizen of Israel, and about 20% of the citizens of Israel are Palestinian, Muslim and Christians and Druze, first language Arabic, would they rather be in that field of Arabic language studies, or would they prefer to be as far as possible from it? And unsurprisingly, the latter was their decision. From 1948, and actually from the 1940s up until today, Palestinian citizens of Israel were not an active part of the debate about Arabic language studies in Israel. There were times that they were not part at all, and there were times that they had one representative at the Ministry of Education out of 15, just to say that it's not 0 to 16. In other words, the securitization of the field, or treating security as a commonsensical member, as a commonsensical part of the debate, has created to the emptying of the field from Arab Palestinian speakers of Arabic. It has created a monopoly in the field of Arabic language studies, in which the main decision makers have always been Jewish Israelis. And as you can imagine, I'm a Jewish Israeli. I know Arabic, I love Arabic, I do many things in Arabic. It's not that I say, don't work with Yoni when you discuss Arabic, but it's something different. I think that the debate about Arabic in Israel must be a debate that is able to take equal participation of Palestinians and Jews together, and maybe also a majority-led participation of Palestinians. But my point is not that we need to have only Palestinians that will be able to speak about Arabic, but I just find it almost surreal that we have debate over debate over debate over debates in Israel about Arabic that is free of Arabs and that is conducted in Hebrew only because the Jewish participants who participate in the debate about Arabic cannot speak Arabic. Because the idea is that Arabic should be taught in Israeli schools in Hebrew. It brings me back to the Latinization of Arabic and the way that we look at Arabic in a very philological, orientalistic way. Another thing that have happened is that once you have such a strong, solid component in the debate, other components are marginalized. And one important component is that Arabic used to be or needs to be a language of integration, Jewish integration into the region. Today, if I translate it into Hebrew, people might get very upset. Why should we get integrated to the region? Why should we become Arabs? Why should we still speak Arabic as a first language, and so on and so forth? And I think that this is all outcomes of a new model of thinking, new model of thought, that is obviously connected to the rise of Zionist movement in the country, to the creation of the State of Israel, and to the idea that Israel should be a northeastern country in the East. Not sure if we should say Western country in the East, but it is not going to integrate into the Middle East, and the people and the leadership is quite proud about it. I think the only thing that Benjamin Netanyahu, the previous prime minister, and Ehud Barak, the previous prime minister, and current prime minister Naftali Bennett and Ehud Barak, and Yair Lapid, they all agree on one slogan in Hebrew, that Israel will always be a villa in the jungle. And I think that once you say that this is what connects the right wing and the left wing of Israeli leadership, it is quite telling in understanding how Israel looks at itself in the Middle East and how Israel looks at the Middle East. And the only way to be able to perpetuate this kind of worldview, looking at Israel as a villa and looking at the Middle East as a jungle, is by making sure that Arabic will be tamed, making sure that Arabic will not be able to lead the students to the Arab culture, to the Palestinian people, to the Palestinian history, to the Arabic countries. It is almost needed to be taught as a language that will cement the current political situation of an ongoing conflict, and on the fact that Israel is not a regular part in the Middle East. In other words, and I will finish with this, instead of looking at the language of the other, the neighbor, language of the region, as the language that can actually bring people together. Sometimes I say to my student, imagine that I know some French and I go and visit Paris. Will the people hate me, or they think, oh, it's very nice, we can speak with him in French? If I know some German and I go and visit Berlin, will the people there be upset that I know German, or they will say, very nice, he studied the language? If I know Arabic and I go visit Palestinian villages in Israel or in the West Bank, or in Gaza, obviously, the Palestinian people will be less likely to support me if they know that I speak Arabic than if I spoke with them in Hebrew or in English. Because once you speak in Arabic, it means that you were connected, or you are connected, or you are going to be connected to the military apparatus that actually suppresses the rights of Palestinians. So we created a situation that is almost rare, in which the language of the other, and also an official language of the state, or at least a language of special status, instead of being considered as a language that brings people together, is almost the complete opposite. It is considered as a language, or it is eventually brings people to be more further away from one another because of the security connotation in the field. And I kind of try to speak very generally today about Arabic in the education system, but also Arabic in the general debate in Israel. And you are all on mute, so I'm not sure if I should be grateful for being quiet or just being grateful for putting yourself in mute. But obviously, I'll be happy if you have any questions or comments or insights or things that you feel should have been discussed differently.
Okay, thank you very much, Yonatan. I'll yield the floor now to Sinfree to pose some questions to you.
Oh, thanks a lot, Yonatan. I want to broaden the discussions beyond Israel and ask the following questions. I think what the Israeli case illustrates, particularly in terms of securitization, is the role of the military in, let's say, applied linguistics. I think what has been underestimated is the extent to which the military as an institution, or military as institutions across the globe, have played critically important roles in shaping our imaginations about language proficiency, notions about native speakers, etc. That all these are tied somehow to the role the military has played. In applied linguists, I think, have tended to give credit and talked about education and avoided addressing the role that the military plays in understanding, in shaping what we do. For example, when you were talking, I was just looking at what is called in the US, the Defense Language Institute, which teaches a number of different languages, for example, including Arabic, Standard Arabic, Pashto, and a lot of other different languages. So there's a lot of language learning that takes place within the Army. But as applied linguists, the Army hasn't been a site that we have studied, even though, for example, the activities in the Army have subsequently shaped what we do as applied linguistics. So that is where I think your work becomes very interesting and generally relevant beyond, I think, beyond the Israeli situation. Because, for example, one of the major driving forces which brought about changes in applied linguistics was the role that language played during the Second World War, right? And it fundamentally changed notions about what constituted language learning, what constituted native speakers, etc. So I would like to ask the question to our international audience, to ask them to focus for the time being in response, to talk about how does the army deal with issues about language in the different contexts across the globe, which they are familiar with. Now, to try and ask what the underlying question here is, in what way has securitization in the different contexts across the globe that we know shaped and changed how language is taught or how language is learned, right? Let me ask Ashraf, because it would be interesting to hear how the Sudanese case plays itself out in terms of the role of the army. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Where's Ashraf? Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Sinfri. That's very interesting question. I agree. That the army monitors even what, for example, currently, because there's a military regime dominating the politics, every bit of official discourse is now monitored. And by the security forces. They contact, for example, just 2 days ago, they contacted one of the daily papers because they used the word coup. They asked them not to use the word coup. Otherwise, the license would be taken away from them. So what the military or the army actually is trying to do is to impose a particular notion of language. A language that's purified of any critique or any criticism or any attack of the army. The army should be seen as the defender of the people. There is a particular discourse which the army is trying to impose on people, which is undemocratic discourse, and people have to buy into that discourse, either not in this context, not by ideology, but by force. Literally speaking, get killed if you try to defy their discourse. And this is what people actually on the ground are doing now. It's not just a revolution for democracy, it's also a revolution for a culture, you can say cultural revolution, or in a sense, so the securitization of language, I think, creates a particular understanding of language. This is what actually, I think this is something which I got from Yunus' presentation, is that Arabic, a particular conceptualization of Arabic actually was produced by that process of securitization. And linguistics, I think, was implicated in that process, particularly in the case of, because those guys actually who try to securitize Arabic, in that sense, they depended on some theories in linguistics and used translation. And if we bring on board, for example, the theoretical framework of Yas, the symbolic dimension and the instrumental dimension, Arabic actually was what the security apparatus was trying to do, was to restructure the symbolic content of Arabic language through translation, through teaching, and so on. I think this is something which is very important. So they depended on a particular ideology of language to do that job, to reshape or to restructure the indexical content of Arabic from a language that's associated with the Palestinian, with the Arab, or even with Arab Jews, to the language of the enemy. So they try to reshape, as Yoni said, the trajectory of Arabic in that context. Another interesting thing is that, here I need to bring a statement by John Joseph in his book, because it applies here nicely. He said, when there is a conflict between politics and linguistics, it's politics which overrides. And this case, actually, this statement, applies here very well, very nicely, because as Yoni said, in linguistics, we say Hebrew and Arabic are sister languages. But when it comes to politics, that the relationship is the relation of enemies, they're against each other. So which one dominated? It's the politics, not linguistics. Which is very interesting. And also another thing, funny thing which I got, how Arabic is taught in Israel, within the security apparatus itself. It's taught as self-standing skills. Listening and the spoken actually language of the spoken skill is somehow subordinated. And again, that has to do with the symbolic aspect of language. The final point is about integration, because he mentioned the word integration. Integration, I think, is defined in that context, Israel, from a monolingual perspective, from a Zionist ideology of monolingualism. That's why the Palestinians are seen as always unintegrated, as the enemy, and so on. But if you look at integration from a multilingual perspective, it is actually the people, the monolingual, I can say the people who defend monolingualism are actually unintegrated. That's what I could actually from this very interesting perspective. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Ashraf. Well, maybe continuing on the line Sinfree has suggested, I know there are a few comments here, but I wonder if colleagues in the US university system can comment on the role of Arabic, the interest in Arabic after 9/11, because some of the situations which Yonatan describes seems to have played out in the US following 9/11, the greater interest in Arabic, recruitment of teachers of Arabic from all around the world. I wonder if there's anyone in the US system who...
Sally, do you want to comment on this?
First, I'm tried while I was speaking to you, and maybe I will be able to do it. University of Cambridge. We had a conference in Cambridge that was called Language, Conflict, and Security in the Middle East. Oh, here it is. So eventually, if I'm not wrong, the report, there is a report. The report was written by Dr. Paul Anderson, and I will be more than happy to send you the report. It was already, ages ago, but meanwhile, I will just send you the link to the conference, just because, following of what Sinfree have said, in that conference, we tried to bring together different questions relating to language and security, looking at the situation in America, United States, and in Britain, and there were a few also from Northern Africa, and all in all, it was an interesting conference, and I think that if you read the report that was written by Paul, all of those who are interested in in this will be able at least to see the different case studies that were discussed. I will just say two things about the local case and its connection to international cases. When, for example, when I spoke about Arabic and propaganda, and in the 1930s and 1940s, it is not that the Zionist movement operated in a vacuum. A lot of the ideas to use language or to harness language also for security and strategic reasons came from European countries, and in this case from Britain. A lot of this kind of new methods and outlook and perception of how Arabic can help the Zionist movement strategically win the hearts and minds of the Arabs. I saw one person who was written also about BBC in different languages. So it was then that a radio station that was called صوت إسرائيل باللغة العربية, the voice of Israel in Arabic, was created. So obviously the decision was to create a radio channel that is not straightforward propaganda, but it's about 22 hours of singing and songs and only a little bit of news. And the news were the songs were the bait, like to bring people in to listen to the channel, and then to get the news and the narrative through the news. And there is some writing about it. Another thing that I thought was to be mentioned is that we need also to ask ourselves, when we speak about army or military or security establishment, the place of military and security establishment changes from country to country.
Yes. Yes.
Like in Israel, it is one of the most extreme cases in which the army is being considered as the continuation of civil life. There was a famous saying by one of Israel's chief of staff, because you know Israeli men have to go to the army for 3 years, between the age of 18 to 21. And then up until to the age of 50 or 47, they have to go every year for 1 month to reserve. So his saying was that an Israeli citizen is a soldier on a 11th month's leave. So, and there is obviously on this, you have a lot of writing, of people writing about militarism in Israel, the role of the military in Israel. Why do soldiers represent always the common good in advertisements and others? Why only through military service you can prove that you served your country, and so on and so forth? How does it reflect on the citizenship of Palestinian citizens of Israel who are not being called to the army, and obviously many of which do not want to be part of the army? So I think that when we speak about militarization or the role of the military in Israel, it is important also to mention the specific components and characteristics and behavior and social place of the army in this specific country. And then obviously to do I think that in that conference, we did a little bit of a comparison between, maybe I can end with this anecdote. We did a little bit of a comparison between Arabic studies in Israel and Hebrew studies in Egypt. And obviously in Egypt also security apparatus is very strong, and the head of the Arabic section in the Israeli education system sat next to the head of the Hebrew sector in the Egyptian education system. And each spoke about how the language is being taught only for peaceful needs, only for fun, only to get to know the other, only to understand how to understand cinema and playwriting and so on and so forth. And when they finished, I asked them, how do you do it? And they said, listen, this is what we have to do, this is what we have to say, and this is what we said. So it's almost even the kind of the discourse is almost built in, that there are things that you will speak about in the public sector and things that you will not speak about when you discuss it with your colleagues and peers in your country of origin. So I thought maybe if we look at Hebrew, at Egyptian context, there are some place for similarities. But obviously, you know, the things that I feel that I have an added value and contribution and new findings are about the Israeli case.
Okay, thank you very much. Lynn Mario has a comment or a question to pose. Lynn Mario.
Thank you, Bassi. Thank you, Yonatan, for that, for your very interesting portrayal of Arabic in Israel. I have a comment and a question, and the comment, and they both refer to how I'm listening to you from two positionalities. Firstly, from a positionality as located within South America at present, where I've been for almost half a century. And the second positionality, which refers to my origins as a Yemeni. So let me begin with my comments. You use the term securitization, which, and listening to this from a Latin American stance, it takes us back to our own history in Latin America of colonization. And I mean, how do Spanish and Portuguese come to be the languages of so-called Latin America, and it gains its its name from these languages, and what happened to all of the indigenous languages. So I think two words which are very important to us in Latin America, especially in terms of our linguistics situation here, which you don't mention, but which I see present in your use of the term securitization, are the two words which are very meaningful to us to explain our linguistic situation here at the moment, or our alienation of our indigenous languages. And the two words are colonization and racialization. So with colonization, and how does securitization come into place here? With the colonization of the Iberians of South America and Central America, even parts of North America, the securitization was not necessarily military, because they didn't come in with full military force, but it came through the settlers. So the settlers were given land rights over indigenous land, and they were responsible for, if you look, especially in English and in the Latin languages, at the etymology of security, it means it's also related to ownership, to making certain, to exercising control. Right? It's not just safety. Right? So what happened in Latin America is, and our theorists, historians have written volumes on this, we call it colonization. An important aspect of colonization was alienating the native, the indigenous. And as you mentioned, Arabic moves from a language of the self to a language of the other. This is what happened here with the indigenous languages. So this process of alienation is a process that our theorists call racialization, where the alienation or the strangeness of the native, the indigenous native in the South American continent, was associated with inferiority, not just strangeness, inferiority because they were not Christian. They did not have signs of material culture that the Iberians expected them to have. And they spoke languages which were not perceived as languages. So racialization, in the sense that it was not connected to race, it was originally connected to this process of alienation, making other, and then attributing inferiority to this other in the interests of taking over their land. Because when you attribute inferiority, you justify control, you justify domination. So colonization and racialization for us are very important in understanding the eradication of indigenous languages in South America, and especially in Brazil, where at the moment they're less than 2% of the population. For a long time, until the 18th century, in large parts of Brazil, even with the descendants of the European settlers here, indigenous languages were spoken. They were the home languages. They were called, in Portuguese, general languages, which were basically of indigenous content. And then when the Portuguese government decided, specifically the Marquis of Pombal at the end of the 18th century, with the rise of the Enlightenment in Europe, decided to civilize in Brazil, the Portuguese colony of Brazil. He prohibited the use of indigenous languages by the settler communities, especially, and imposed Portuguese. So we can't separate colonization, racialization from securitization. Right? What you term as securitization. And I'm wondering how they play out. It would be difficult to talk about this, I understand, in your context, because how can we deal with racism when we are talking about, as you mentioned, nations who are equally Semitic? Yeah? But I'd like to hear what you'd have to say then, how securitization goes more than just military security. It also deals with imposing a certain alienation meaning inferiority as well. So that's where the racialization component comes in. Now,
I'll be happy to. Hello,
Yeah.
I'll be happy to answer it, but the only question is, I waited for a sentence to be said about your Yemeni.
Yeah, that's where my question comes in.
I see. I thought
The
that
first
there
was
is
a comment. Now,
Oh, I see. I see.
as a Yemeni in origin, we have this curious and also of Portuguese origin, hence my name. We were Portuguese speakers in the Yemen, and we had, I come from a family of doctors, and my family had lots of contact with traders who came from Palestine at the time, Jewish traders who came from Palestine to the Yemen, speaking, and they were seen as we interacted with them speaking Ladino. They spoke Ladino and we spoke Portuguese. And my family was connected with the magic carpet operation from the Yemen of Yemeni Jews. And a lot of the negotiations took place in Ladino. Now, you haven't mentioned Ladino. I'm curious, what happens to Ladino in, so it's not in, as the Zionist ideology in trying to desperately create a nation in Israel and imposing a single language. So it's not just Arabic that is eradicated, it's other Jewish languages which are also spoken in Palestine. What happened to Ladino?
I'll start with the last comment of yours. I think Arabic became an enemy of the Zionist movement, first for political reasons, as because of the conflict and so on and so forth, but also because it represented integration, and it represented being part of the region, and it represented a non-colonized way of thinking, or a non-colonial way of thinking. And I will refer also to colonization later on. The other great enemy, by the way, of the Zionist movement was Yiddish, followed by Ladino, but more so Yiddish, because Yiddish and Ladino represented alternatives for languages that are Jewish, but are not particularly nationalistic or calling for a national separation, or calling for the creation of an army, or calling for the creation of a border, or calling for the creation of a flag, and so on and so forth. So in a way, the other languages of different immigrants in Israel paid the price of the monolingual Hebrew revival and so on and so forth. I just believe that the erasure or the eradication of Arabic is more echoing than other languages, because my grandparents came from Germany in the 1930s. They moved to a country, and again, we can speak a lot about different things, but they moved to a country that does not border any German country. And they moved to a country that have no connection to German languages. And they moved to a country that German was not its official language and was not spoken by the majority of the people in the country. Arabic was supposed to be the language to be preserved by whatever entity here, because it is the language of the region, the language of the people, the language of the majority, a Semitic language, and so on and so forth. So I feel that the eradication and the erasure of Arabic is so powerful, it's so dramatic, just because of these things. About colonization, I hope it's not apologetic. I should have used it. Many times in my discussions, I use the word colonial thinking and colonization. I think that we cannot imagine an idea of separation here in Palestine, creating a village that will be called a tower and gate, that is not coming out of a colonial idea, that we need to create enclaves that will be for Jewish people only. So it's obviously the colonial idea is very much there in the idea, first of settler colonialism in the East, but also the things that I kind of more feel that is even more powerful is the idea of separation. on all levels. About alienating the languages of the indigenousness, I think it's a very important thing, and I think that I should have also spoken more widely or more deeply about it. Here, I see two follow-up processes for those that you spoke about. First, this proximity between Hebrew and Arabic, or between Jews and Arabs, you know, Semitic languages, people who also see each other as not similar, but some resemblance between the two, forced the Zionist movement, but also vis-a-vis language, to look at the other language not as the indigenous language of the other, but as a misrepresentation of the indigenous language of the self. Eliezer ben Yehuda, who was one of the most important revivals of Hebrew, or renewals of Hebrew, have said, I need to have new words in Hebrew. I need to renew the Hebrew language. I need to have a new national language. Arabic was taught here for the last 2,000 years. Hebrew was not taught for the last 2,000 years. Actually, I can say that every root that exists in Arabic actually used to exist before Arabic, also in Hebrew. So we are thanking the Arabs for keeping Arabic. We are thanking the Arabs for cultivating the land in the traditional ways, because they helped us to preserve our language and our traditional ways, and so on and so forth. So there is almost a fight over indigenousness that I think should have been mentioned by myself. And generally, I think the alienating and looking at the indigenous with characteristics that are by and large inferior was very much part of the creation of the state, but also the creation of the status of Arabic in Israel and the connection in between them. In the last survey that they did, they let Jewish Israelis listen to Arabic spoken by Arab people, and they gave it to people who do not speak Arabic. The first reaction to Arabic was hate. The first reaction was fear. The second was hate. So fear and hate were the two emotions firstly associated with Arabic for Jews. And here we speak about a country that Arabic is official, Semitic, and so on and so forth. According to the last statistics, less than 1.4% of Jewish Israelis can write an email in Arabic. Less than 0.5% of Jewish Israelis can read a book in Arabic. So the idea of having two languages, that it's supposed to be the easiest for Jewish Israelis to study Arabic. It is supposed to be easier for Jewish Israelis to study Arabic than to study English, obviously. But psychologically speaking, and this is evident already, Jewish Israelis say Arabic is way more difficult for us to study than other languages. And I think without the alienation and without the foreignization and without the that you make something inferior, it would have been difficult for Jewish Israelis to look at Arabic as such a difficult, problematic, hated, full of bad emotions language. And yes, obviously, maybe if we had more time, we could speak more about it also, but I believe both comments are fair and should have been mentioned also in the discussion, in the talk.
Okay, thank you very much, Yonatan and Lin-Mario. There was a question from Sangita, who wanted to know how Arabic is faring in the cultural sector in the 21st century. Sangita, would you want to say one or two things more to clarify the question?
Well, no, I was just curious. I went into the Eurovision Song Contest, and if you look at the wiki page, it's very fascinating to see that Hebrew is present from the 1970s, and then English comes in, and English is now very dominant. And Arabic, according to that page at least, is only present once together with Hebrew. So I was just curious as to You've mentioned literature, and so if you go beyond the securitization, does Arabic play any kind of role in theater, in people's spontaneous work with stand-up poetry or comedy? So the very grassroots cultural settings, what is the role of Arabic?
I see. Thanks for this. There is a very famous saying about Israel being a state that is Jewish and democratic. I think it is said by MK Ahmad Tibi. He said, of course, it is Jewish and democratic. It's democratic for the Jews and it's Jewish for the Arabs. And I think it's similar things we can say about the Arabic language. Arabic was always seen and perceived and considered, in Israel, as an official language. But it was not official in the sense of live, dynamic language in the Jewish community. It was official language in the sense of that for different reasons, Israel did not want to erase Arabic as an official language, but it was official language maybe in line with what Lynn Mario de Souza said before, that it was needed in order to preserve separation. The one thing that, for example, in Israel have is that two school systems. One school system is held in Arabic and one school system is in Hebrew. This is the majority one for Jewish Israeli students. So Arabic is a live language, and you have a lot of books written in Arabic, a lot. Well, you have relatively, and you have plays being played in Arabic, and you have movies even created in Arabic, but they are representative of the Palestinian internal circles. So, which means that you have a Palestinian novelist who will write a book in Arabic that will later be translated or not be translated to Hebrew. But the Israeli public sphere, including songs in the Eurovision, including street signs, including discussions in the Knesset, including lectures in the university, including songs and poems being written, are the hegemonic language is very predominantly Hebrew. Actually, many scholars who are looking at the place of Arabic in the Jewish community have said that we are now in the first period or in the first moment in the history of the world that there is no Jewish creation in Arabic. That the only creation in Arabic from the country is made by Palestinians, Muslim or Christians or Jews, but not by Jewish Israelis. And I think that the Eurovision, I'm not sure which song sang in Hebrew and Arabic, but it was kind of maybe an idea of a political statement that that specific group wanted to make, that Arabic is also here and that we should respect it. But by and large, looking at the Israeli public sphere, it is being dominated by Hebrew language.
Okay, thank you very much, Yonatan. There is a question from Deboho around the difference between Arabic as a language not associated with Islam and the association of Arabic with Islam. He'd like you to kindly clarify things for him.
Is it for me?
Yes.
I'm not sure I can. Can you repeat it again?
Okay, so he's basically asking whether Arabic is necessarily associated with Islam.
Ah, sorry, I misheard the word Islam.
Oh.
Arabic is associated in Israel, and I speak about this case study, as the language that represents the Arab people or the Arab Palestinian people or the Palestinians of 48. I mean, the first connotation that Arabic has in here is a language of the Arab other, which is again quite important because it was not always associated with the Arab other. It was also very much of a Jewish language, as we said before. I think that within certain Muslim communities, Arabic is firstly associated and perceived as associated with Islam and with Quran. But again, imagine here in Israel, we have a very strong national Palestinian movement. And some of the most important leaders and scholars and thinkers of the Palestinian national movement were Christians. So Arabic was used as a language of lectures and a language of debates, a language of discussion, a language of unity surrounding Arab-Palestinian identity, more than between Muslim and Christians. But again, it's a fair question. I feel that in some Muslim communities it will be more evident, but by and large, speaking about Israelis and Palestinians in Israel, I think it is not so much connected to Islam and Quran, but it's more connected to the national conflict or the political conflict.
Okay, thank you very much. I wonder if there are any other comments and questions for Yonatan?
I wanted to say that I have to run because of the two children downstairs and that I was asked for some help, but I will be more than happy to receive anything from you, meaning if you have questions, if something that I said was not clear, or if you want me, I don't know, if you think that it will be interesting to refer to other research. And I put my personal email, I'm from the 15th century, I still use Hotmail. But yeah, I will be more than happy again if you have any comments, if you feel again that we spoke about some sensitive issues here, and I don't know, many times there are also Palestinians in the audience, so I always feel that I need to be careful not to represent the Palestinian cause because I'm not a Palestinian. But so if you feel that there is like a few of the things that you said, I feel will be important for me also to read, if it's the last research that was written about language and politics or others. But just because I said to my wife that I will start helping at 5:30, so I have to run.
Okay. Yeah. I think...
Can I say something quickly, please? Yoni is an Israeli, but he's an activist for the Palestinian rights to have their state. Yoni always is on the streets. You see him in the street fighting for the right of the Palestinians. And now he said he is not a Palestinian. And I say to him, if we take identity as a form of social practice, so we are Palestinian by practice. You're not Palestinian by biology, but you are Palestinian by practice.
Professor Suleiman approve it, because he's not here with us, but he would approve it. Okay.
Thank you.
Many thanks. Sorry that I have to run like that, but I will be more than happy to receive your comments, and thank you very much for inviting me.